Presentation, I would like to address our recent FTA negotiations involving Southeast Asian countries, the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations, and finally our current regional FTA negotiations, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and also the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. This is a Venn diagram. Some people like it, others don't. I find it useful. But before getting into it, I've just observed that since the late 1990s, there has been an increasing regional trend towards the negotiation of free trade agreements. This trend has been particularly marked in East Asia, sometimes described as the new Asia-Pacific regionalism. Characteristics include new countries becoming involved in FTAs, for example, China, Japan, the Republic of Korea. Countries negotiating many agreements simultaneously. Countries making agreements with others that are not close neighbours, and an increasingly broader FTA agenda beyond goods. This Venn diagram uses a series of overlapping and intersecting circles to demonstrate the relationships and overlapping memberships of the various East Asian and Asia-Pacific regional groupings. The diagram seeks to illustrate the context for Australia's trade engagement in the region. It does not show Australia's bilateral FTAs. But let me take you briefly through it from left to right. Firstly, ASEAN. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations was established in 1967 to accelerate economic growth and social progress in Southeast Asia and to promote regional peace and stability. The 10 ASEAN member states, James has already detailed, and they're shown there in the circle, the ASEAN circle. Second, ANSFTA, that shows you the agreement establishing the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area, comprising the 10 ASEAN member states, Australia and New Zealand. Third, you move up to the ASEAN Plus 3, and that's a forum that functions as a coordinator of cooperation between ASEAN and China, Japan and the Republic of Korea. Fourth, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, which involve the 10 ASEAN member states and ASEAN 6 FTA partners. ASEAN has FTAs with China, Japan, Korea, India, and Australia and New Zealand. So all those countries are now participating in RCEP negotiations. We note also East Asia Summit is a regional leaders forum for strategic dialogue and cooperation on key challenges facing the East Asian region. Membership of the EAS comprises the RCEP countries plus the United States and Russia. US and Russia do not have an FTA with ASEAN at the moment. However, the US is involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement negotiations, which is seeking to build on the so-called P4 agreement between Brunei, Chile, New Zealand and Singapore, which entered into force in 2006. TPP negotiations now include the original P4 parties and 7 other countries. I suggest I stop there for our current purposes, but apart from just noting that the Venn diagram also shows APEC, PACER Plus involving the Pacific Islands, and it also shows those regional countries who are members of the G20. Very briefly, in looking at Australia's existing FTAs, just to note that we've concluded 7 FTAs to date, 6 bilateral and 1 regional. 4 of the 7 FTAs cover Southeast Asian countries, the 3 bilateral FTAs, Singapore, which entered into force in July 2003, Thailand entered into force on 1 January 2005, and as James has already noted, Malaysia entered into force on 1 January this year. and then the regional ASEAN Australia New Zealand FTA, which entered into force on 1 January 2010. The 13 countries covered by our 7 concluded FTAs collectively accounted for 27% of Australia's total two-way trade in goods and services in 2011-12. New Zealand 3.5%, United States 9%, Chile 0.3%, and ASEAN 14.4%. Next now, just very briefly at ANZFTA. This was signed on 27 February 2009 and entered into force for 8 of the 12 signatories on 1 January 2010, including Australia and Malaysia. Thailand became a party in March 2010, Cambodia and Laos in January 2011, and then from 10 January last year, all 12 signatories were party when Indonesia became a party to the agreement. ANZFTA is the largest FTA that Australia has concluded and the most comprehensive FTA concluded by ASEAN. It covers goods, services, investment, intellectual property, e-commerce, temporary movement of business people, competition and economic cooperation. It is most substantial in goods, reflecting the fact that ASEAN has done more internal integration on goods than in the non-goods areas. It contains a substantial tariff outcome. The deal will provide tariff-free treatment on 96% of Australia's current exports to ASEAN nations by 2020. Prior to ANZFTA's entry into force, 67% of Australia's exports to the region were tariff-free. The agreement provides a strong framework to strengthen services and investment outcomes over time. It also contains some useful commitments on trade-related areas such as intellectual property and economic cooperation to promote technical assistance and capacity building to assist developing ASEAN countries in implementation. ANZFTA was the first time that Australia included economic cooperation in a trade agreement, implemented through the ANZFTA Economic Cooperation Support Program. The agreement is forward-looking, with substantial built-in agendas and review mechanisms in areas such as non-tariff measures, rules of origin, services and investment, which are aimed at having ANZFTA's commitments expand and deepen over time with development of an ASEAN economic community. As James noted earlier, it's important, I think, to view ANZFTA as a platform for Australia's ongoing economic engagement with other ASEAN members, and it also provides a benchmark for both bilateral FTAs with individual ASEAN countries and broader ASEAN-centred regional developments like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This graph just illustrates the tariff commitments by Australia, Indonesia and Malaysia under ANZFTA. I've just selected those countries because, well, we're in Australia, we're Australians here, and Indonesia and Malaysia because these two destinations do figure prominently in the Victorian Government's Southeast Asia Super Trade Mission. So just to get a sense of what is legally bound under the agreement by way of tariff commitments. 2005, what that reflects basically WTO commitments under the World Trade Organization agreement. So in the case of Australia, about 47.6% of our tariffs were bound at zero in 2005. We committed on entry into force of ANZFTA to go to 96.4% and then eventually 100% by 2020. Indonesia, 2005, bound rate about 21% of its tariffs are bound at zero. Under ANZFTA, this year, it's on 1 January, 85% of Indonesia's tariffs at zero. That's why it's so significant having Indonesia become a party last year and then increasing to 93.2% by 2025. Malaysia, under Ansperter, around 67%, bounded zero in 2010, but increasing to 96% by 2020. NAFTA. This agreement was signed 22 May last year in Kuala Lumpur and came into force on 1 January this year. This bilateral FTA improves upon Australian and Malaysian commitments made in Ansperter. Upon entry into force of NAFTA this year, Australia eliminated all tariffs on goods imported from Malaysia. That is 100% tariff elimination from 1 January 2013, compared with our commitments under Ansperter of complete tariff elimination on 1 January 2020. So we brought that forward in the bilateral. Malaysia, under NAFTA, bound tariff-free access on 97.6% of recent Malaysian goods imports from Australia from entry into force, which will increase to 98.9% in 2016 and 99% in 2017. Key outcomes are detailed in fact sheets available on the DFAT website, and I won't go into it now given the time constraint. But I would note that in respect of services, as James noted, Malaysia has committed to giving Australian entities the right to acquire majority ownership in companies supplying services in Malaysia. Not all services sectors, but in very discrete areas. For example, 70% ownership in higher education services, increasing up to 100% in 2015, 70% ownership in direct insurance services, 70% ownership in telecommunication network services and facility providers. NAFTA also includes measures which assist Australian companies doing business in Malaysia, including business-friendly rules of origin provisions. Australian exporters do not need to supply a certificate of origin, but rather a simpler declaration of origin. More Australian business executives and senior managers are permitted to work in Malaysia and to stay for longer periods. Easier access to visas for spouses and dependents of Australians working in Malaysia. Establishment of a framework for mutual recognition of qualifications and licensing for professionals, and stronger protection of Australian trademarks and copyright. So, NAFTA is delivering for Australian businesses and will help Australian businesses looking to expand their presence in Asia. To mention Indonesia now, the first round of formal negotiations opened in Jakarta in late September last year and concluded last month. The negotiating teams finalised guiding principles for the negotiations and agreed a forward work program to the end of next year. And the second round has been scheduled to be held in Australia in June or July. In 2011-12, Indonesia was Australia's 12th largest two-way trading partner, accounting for 2.4% of Australia's total trade. And there's a lot of strong political leadership provided in wanting to take these negotiations to a successful conclusion.